from now on, we're recording everybody, but attendees don't need to worry because your video or audio is not captured. It's just the panelists and presenters that are captured. A bit of housekeeping. You can ask questions by typing them into the chat, and then I'll pick them up and I'll put them to our speaker when we come to question and answer at the end. So if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the, see at the bottom, it says Q&A. That's the best way to draw attention to your question. You can also put them in the chat, but there it disappears among lots of messages from people saying they can't hear and things like that. Yes. And the recording will be made available on the website archaeologyorkney.com, probably on Monday, but maybe sooner. Yes, okay, so introductions. Yeah, my name is Ragnhild Jusland. I'm from the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute, and this is our monthly institute seminar where we invite exciting speakers to talk about things we want to hear about, especially new and exciting research. So the speaker this month is Karen Langsholt Holmqvist, and I had the pleasure of meeting Karen for the first time back in November at her PhD Viva, which took place at the University of Oslo. This is all very exciting, and Karen did a fabulous job presenting her research to the audience, because Vivas are public in Norway. I had the pleasure of examining her thesis there. And I thought it was a fantastic piece of work. So I really wanted to invite Karen back to this seminar, and I'm really happy she accepted. Since getting her PhD, Karen has started in a new job with the NLA University College, which is a teacher training college. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what research Karen comes up with next in the area of runology. So today she'll be talking about her work on the runic inscriptions in Maeshowe here in Orkney. Right, that's enough introductions. Over to you, Karen.
Yes, thank you. So yes, as Ragnhild said, I'm going to talk about the runic inscriptions in Maeshowe. And this talk is mostly based on an article that I published in Viking and Medieval Scandinavia. And if you're interested in that article, it's not open access, but Ragnhild has it and I have it. So you can email either of us and we'll forward it to you. And also I will refer to Barnes quite a few times, and his corpus edition is it's not recent, but it's the most recent corpus edition still of the Maeshowe inscriptions. So I use the numberings and mostly also the interpretations from Barnes. So today I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to Maeshowe. I think you all know what it is, but just in case someone don't, I'll show you a picture and a map. And also an introduction to the Maeshowe rune carvers. And I'll give you an introduction to cognitive and practice theory very briefly. And then we'll talk about the inscriptions in Maeshowe and the expressions of self there. So, Maeshowe is a Neolithic chambered cairn located in the middle of mainland in Orkney. And it holds 33 inscriptions from the 12th century. And those inscriptions are what I'm going to talk about, and not the Neolithic past. Yes. So, who were the carvers? First of all, the carvers themselves say something about who they were, or at least who entered this mound. So first, one carver states that that is a Viking, or alternatively the name Vikingir, then came underneath to this place. So this sentence is a bit odd, and it's because something is amiss in the middle. Also, we have an inscription stating that Jerusalem men broke this mount, and a third one saying that Jerusalem travelers broke Orkhauger, and Liv, the Earl's housekeeper, carved the runes. So these carvers say that Jerusalem men were in the mount and probably carved runes. And the first inscription also indicates that maybe Vikings were there, but we don't know that quite because it's, yeah. For instance, we have a lacuna, which makes this interpretation a bit difficult. But it still says something, I think, about the ideas of who were in this mound and who has been there, and how they see themselves. And this Jerusalem travel is usually thought to have been Earl Rognvalders traveling to Jerusalem in the mid 12th century. And his group of travelers were, for a large part, Norwegians who came to Orkney, stayed there over winter, and traveled to Jerusalem after that. And the saga says that this journey became very famous, and everyone who had traveled was considered all the greater. So according to the saga, this journey was something that people would have been proud to participate in. So if some of them were in Orkney afterwards as well, this is probably something they would take in as part of their view of themselves. But there is also another event that's connected to Maeshowe in the sagas, and this is the only instance in Orkneyinga saga where Maeshowe is actually mentioned. And this is from around about the same time, and when Rognvald is in Jerusalem or on his travels. And the saga says that Earl Harald set out for Orkney at Christmas. He had 4 ships and 100 men. He lay off Grimsey or Gramsey for 2 days. Then he put in at Havnavogi, Strømnes, on Rossay, mainland. And on the 13th day of Christmas, they traveled on foot over the fjord or firth. And they were in Orkhaugi, Maeshowe, when rough weather came upon them, and there 2 of them went insane, and that hindered their travels badly. It was nighttime when they reached the firth. So according to this this story, the carvers took shelter in Maeshowe during a storm and spent some time there. So this would also be a very good occasion for carving runes, of course, when they're stuck in this room together for some time. And also a few things must have been going on when 2 of them apparently went insane in there. So it's a fun setting to kind of speculate a bit about who the carvers were. Yes. Also, just returning to the Norwegian theme with Earl Rognvald's group of carvers, or of Jerusalem travelers, I mean. They in Norway we have a few locations with graffiti which resemble the Maeshowe graffiti. So that makes, in my opinion, the Rognvald connection quite likely, because his group of carvers, his group of travelers would probably have been very familiar with the Norwegian runic tradition, so they could have taken that into Maeshowe. And Rognvald is also known to have been a good rune carver himself, according to the sagas at least. So I'll just stop briefly by my theoretical approach. I've used cognitive theory and practice theory, and I combined them to see or to study the self. In cognitive theory, we see the self as a cognitive construction and also a process, and this gives a very flexible and fluent self, which is in constant change. Just think of how your thoughts change when you enter new contexts, for instance. So the self will be flexible in the same way. While in practice theory, the self is seen as a social construction, and this makes a more stable self, which is created in the social practice. So when you enter a practice, you will take on that self in the practice and kind of connect to that. So from my perspective, I see the self as both a cognitive and a social construction. So the self visible in the inscriptions is a negotiation between the carvers' cognitive self-understanding and the social conditions of the practice. Yes. So, ready for the inscriptions, I think. This first, I just want to show you a floor plan of Maeshowe with kind of the walls as well. So I've tried to indicate where the inscriptions are located in Maeshowe to show how they are standing in relation to each other. And as you can see, I've sorted the inscriptions here into categories, and the inscriptions may belong to more than one category. But these categories are the treasure inscriptions and the mound inscriptions. Those are quite overlapping, not completely, but partly, and sexual inscriptions and name inscriptions. That's inscriptions which simply state a name. And we have agent inscriptions. That's inscriptions with a name and a verb, typically carved runes. And then we have self-assertive inscriptions where the carver presents themselves in a way, and religious elements. So this final category is includes crosses, so not only inscriptions but also crosses. And when we move on, I want to start with this group of 10 inscriptions that we have in the southeastern corner of Maeshowe. So we see 10 inscriptions grouped together, and they are located all on 2 adjacent stones, as you can see. And if we just go back for a moment, you can see that it's a lot of free space in Maeshowe, so they could have chosen other stones to carve on also, but these inscriptions, I think, are intended to be standing together because these 2 stones are quite cluttered. And I've used color markings here to just show how the inscriptions are fit together, and each color marks one inscription. And the first one is this mound was constructed before Lodbrok's. Her sons, they were bold, such were men as they were of themselves. And then I will continue reading them in, as far as I can remember, Barnes' suggested order of carving. He suggests that the next inscription is the purple one. In the northwest is great wealth concealed. And then the green one at the bottom corner, Håkon alone carried wealth out of this mound. And fortunate is he who can find the great riches in light blue. Then we have the dark blue one. It was long ago that great wealth was concealed here. And in violet, Jerusalem travelers broke Orkhauger, leave the Earl's housekeeper carved. So what we see in these inscriptions is that the carvers, they create a narrative together. They are not completely, they don't completely agree on what happened, but they all contribute a piece of information about the origins of the mound and things, stories that have taken place in this mound. And they do this as a group, trying to create a story together. And also in the left corner, you see 4 names or attempts at carving names. And I've interpreted those inscriptions as attempts at carving names and also as attempts at marking some belonging to this discourse, maybe from people who were not literate enough to carve their own long inscriptions, because as well, it's not very visible here, but those runes are very uncertain and not always easy to discern. So it looks as though those were attempts at carving runes from someone who are not quite literate. So these 10 inscriptions, they also relate to several other inscriptions in Maeshowe, and I'll start by talking about 2 of them who are marked with red in this picture. First of all, number 8 that you see up here. So this inscription goes, and you can see that part of it is missing, so it's not possible to read all of it, so it starts mid-sentence. It's told to me that treasure is hidden here well enough. Few say as Oddur Örkason said in those runes which he carved. And what we see in this inscription is that for the first thing is that it takes up the topic of the treasure and adds more information about this treasure in a very oral manner, because it refers to what Odd Örkason said. So it's very context-bound. It assumes that others know who Odd Örkason is and which runes he carved, not least because there is no inscription signed by Odd Örkason in Maeshowe. But another interesting thing about this inscription is that, can you see the mouse when I point? Yeah. So in this area, it looks like the inscription is crossed out. And I've seen this as an attempt at concealing the information about this treasure in the inscription, and not because it is secret, but as part of this discourse of telling stories and creating a narrative together. So this adds to the narrative by kind of making it secret and something worth hiding. So yeah, it adds to this playfulness we see. And we can see the same in this inscription, number 4, which we can read the whole of this inscription, but you can still see some crossing out here as well. And this inscription goes that will be true, which I say, that treasure was carried away. Treasure was carried away 3 nights before they broke this mound. And as you can see, this inscription doesn't really say anything about where the treasure was carried to, so it doesn't add any information worth concealing. So I think this crossing out, it looks deliberate because it's so deep, but I think this attempt at concealing information is mainly as a part of a play, or part of the fun of the storytelling. Yes. So I'll move forward to these inscriptions. You've seen them before, but here you can also see where they are located, here, here, and here. And these inscriptions, as I showed you earlier, they say something about who entered the mound. So together, all of these inscriptions create a narrative about the mound, and it shows that Maeshowe itself is quite a hot topic inside Maeshowe. and the carvers are very eager to tell stories and contribute pieces of information, and also competing pieces of information about the origins and the myths about Maeshowe. So I'll move on to the next topic in Maeshowe, and that's, I've called it Desire in the Cairn, and this group is quite diverse. But we'll start, I think, with this inscription number 9 here. And it goes, Ingebjørg, hin fagra ekkja, mörk kona hever farit lut in her, Mikkel Overflati, Erlinger. So it's divided in 4. The first line is Ingebjørg, the fair widow. Next line, many a wife has travelled stooping in here, a great show-off. And the final one, Erling, a name. And the first line is could be a declaration of love, but the second line adds information that sounds more like Erling is, because we assume that Erling is the carver. That's of course only something we can assume, as it doesn't say that he carved it, but it looks like he takes an almost ironic approach to these women coming into the cairn, and the stooping could be a reference to both a sexual position, but also just going into Maeshowe makes you stoop because it's so low. So it could be either a double reference or just ambiguous. But it seems, especially with this final edition, a great show-off. It seems a bit like he's taking an ironic approach to the inscriptions, no, to the women in Maeshowe. Yes. And I'll move on to another inscription, number 10. And this inscription is located inside one of the side chambers in Maeshowe, and it could maybe indicate some of what the women did in Maeshowe who came stooping in, because the inscription says that Thorny fact and Helgi carved. So it's quite explicit, and we don't know, of course, what Helgi did other than carving. He could be the lucky one, or he could also just be hiding in this side chamber, watching what's going on in the main room. And we also have another inscription in one of these side chambers, which says that Ingigerd is the most beautiful woman. So this could also be a man sitting and just watching what's going on. But of course, he might also make himself a bit more innocent than he is. Who knows? And of course, this also might just be bragging. It could be stories that they create more than actual things going on, just like the treasure. The final inscription I want to show you is a futhark. And it could be only a futhark, but if you look at the ending and compare it to this blue one, is an ordinary futhark, and it ends with MLY. This futhark ends with YN and U. So Barnes argues that it's possible to look at these lines which run between the runes and underneath them, and to look at only the runes kind of in between these lines. And if you do that, you will get Fud och Ast no. And here we're at the crucial point about the futhark, because it begins with a word for the female genitals. So this gives us cunt and love now. And this, I quite like this this interpretation, because it shows some of the playfulness, or the possibilities in the playfulness. If this is interpreted correctly, it shows that the carvers are quite playful, and we'll see several examples of playful carvers afterwards as well. But still, I just want to point out that I can't really make these vertical lines fit perfectly with the runes that we're supposed to read in between. So yeah, it's a nice interpretation, but it could be just a futhark. So, as I said, there is quite a lot of playfulness in Maeshowe, and that's what I want to do now. First of all, let's just return to Erling and his inscription. He signs his inscription with cryptic runes, and this first rune shows his the A rune, but the A rune does not have a separate cryptic rune, and that's because of how the cryptic rune system is set up. I won't go into detail about that now, but what he has done is he used the A rune, or A, and he has added an A branch to this cryptic rune, so it's an A with an added A branch. And A, I don't know, yes, here this is an A. So if you're not familiar with, for instance, the Norwegian alphabet, you won't be familiar with the A, but this is the A. Yes. So in any case, by adapting his this rune, Erling shows that he's a very capable rune carver. He does not only know the cryptic rune system, which is quite advanced, but he also is familiar enough with it to adapt it to make his own rune into a cryptic rune in a way. And then we also have a carver using cryptic runes, writing that the man who is most skilled in runes west of the ocean carved these runes with the axe which Geir Trandilsson owned in the south of the country. And this inscription writes the first two words, these runes, with cryptic runes. So that demonstrates his runic skills. But if you were not able to see how skilled he is just by reading these cryptic runes, then he states it explicitly to you that he is the most skilled in runes west of the ocean. So here you are, the most skilled carver. So he definitely takes up the competition with Erling, and just to add to it, he also claims to have used a mythical axe. Geir Trandilsson is known from the sagas and as a saga warrior, so by claiming that he has this axe, he ties himself back to a mythical past, and this also fits very well with these inscriptions about the mythical past of Maeshowe. So it ties it to the rune carving as well. Yes. Then we also have a completely different approach to the cryptic runes. This inscription is carved perhaps by a carver called Trygg, but this first reading is uncertain, because this carver has made up completely his own rune system. So the only reason Magnus Olsen, who suggested this reading, has been able to interpret the inscription is that he uses a standard formula, but of course the name is not a standard formula, so that part is uncertain. So this is also a way to show how skilled you are in runes. And finally, a fourth carver is also very eager to show how skilled he is. And he did this by carving an inscription high up on the wall, about 3 meters, I think. And as you can see from the picture, it's actually, I used a ladder to try to get up there, but I didn't get far enough up. So I had to take the picture from downwards. Yes. So this carver uses, he takes up the competition about being a skilled rune carver in Maeshowe, and he does it not by showing how advanced runes he is able to carve, but by showing how physically able he is. And this is a drawing by Jens Beck, showing how this inscription could have been carved. I also like it because it shows how the carving of runes in Maeshowe is a very social act. There are 2 inscriptions in Maeshowe which probably required 2 carvers, but to me it seems very obvious that many of these inscriptions were carved not alone, but by a community of carvers. Yes, I don't know why that came again, but okay. We'll move on to the Christian references. First of all, of course, we have Christian references in these inscriptions referring to Jerusalem travelers. That shows an awareness of the carvers living in a Christian society and also a pride in taking part in the religious society. But we also have carved crosses, deeply cut in Maeshowe, and some embellished age runes. And this has a shape which is quite similar to the cross. So we find embellished age runes in number 15, 20, and also 17 in the middle here. And as you can see, this inscription is also surrounded by crosses. And then we have finally an inscription mentioning that Benedict made this cross. The odd thing about that inscription is that it's not any cross nearby it. So he states that he made a cross, but he didn't actually add any cross. And none of these inscriptions contain prayers or any explicit written Christian references. So if you compare it to the church inscriptions, you'll see that the church inscriptions have much more prayers. They have expressions of devotions and references to the Virgin Mary and the saints. We don't find any of those kinds of inscriptions in Maeshowe, but we still see some awareness of the carvers being in a Christian society. So they didn't leave their Christian identity behind when they entered. And also the fact that this age rune is repeated across the mount shows that this is also a topic that maybe one carver started it and others repeat the same pattern and take it up in their inscriptions as well. So that's also, I think, a social thing inside Maeshowe. So we're ready for the conclusions. In Maeshowe, we find a very mixed set of identities expressed. We find carvers expressing an adventurous self, and carvers expressing a sort of sexual interest, sexual identity, or just maybe sexual is probably too strong, but desirous or whatever you think is best. and also a carving self, which is quite strong in Maeshowe, and finally the religious self. But most of all, I think these inscriptions show a social self, because the carvers, even though they are created by individuals, they all adhere to some selected social practices inside this mound, and they create inscriptions together and relate strongly to each other to create a community around the inscriptions. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Karen. Thank you. We'll open for questions now. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or you can put it in the Q&A function, and then I'll read it out to Karen. I can't see any questions yet, but I have a question. I remember from your article, I have a kind of head start here because I've also read your article on this. I remember from your article that you compared these treasure hunting inscriptions to other inscriptions from other places in Norway that also talk about hidden treasures. I was wondering, could you share some of that context with us?
Yes, I kind of referred to it briefly without taking in the treasure topic, but yes, as I said, the Maeshowe inscriptions are quite similar to some other inscriptions in Norway. And those other inscriptions are located two of the contexts are large stones, just large stones visible from the sea, so in the coastal areas. And on those stones you find inscriptions saying that gold and magic, I think, is hidden underneath this stone. And there's also an inscription stating that I think travelers to Risaland, don't remember the interpretation of that, but that they passed through here, and that the treasure they found was hidden underneath this stone. And also you have those two stones are in the western part of Norway, and there's one in the central part of Norway, Trøndelag, which also has it's a rock face, and the inscription states that there's a treasure hidden underneath there as well. So yes, I think these inscriptions show that the act of telling stories about landscape, or what do you call it, elements in the landscape, visible elements in the landscape. That's a common theme in narratives, at least in Norway, it seems. And you find it in myths and legends in Norway now as well. And it seems that people actually tied it to or wrote down these stories in runes. Did that make sense? Yeah.
I find all that very exciting. It's like they're in a mythological or kind of legendary storytelling world where rock faces and stones and Maeshowe, the mound, can be a sort of entrance to the underworld. That's the feeling I get from it anyway. That it's an interface between the normal everyday and the extraordinary. Don't know if you agree.
Yes, definitely. And I think if we go to Iceland, for instance, you have also these rocks that are connected to fairies. And to me, this seems very similar in a way. Because these stones also, or the inscriptions on stones also claim that there is magic underneath the stone, not only gold. So, yes.
I've got some questions from the Q&A here now. Chris Matthews was asking, is Benedict a typical Norse name, or is it more a Christian type of name?
Yes, that's a good question. It's a typical Christian type of name. But of course, as Norway was Christian or Christianized, that Christian names were also imported. So it could be that he was actually a priest, for instance, with ecclesiastical ties, but it could also just have been baptized Benedict at birth. Yeah.
Yeah. And he also has another question as, do any of the carvings suggest that the carvings were done by either of the two insane travelers?
I don't think anyone has suggested that. No, of course it's possible, but I think in inscriptions, to me, they seem quite sane. They just seem like those kind of stories that people tell when maybe they've been drinking a beer or two, and it's kind of just now it's written down, of course, but if you just listen to what people tell, it sounds quite a bit like the stories people tell to each other. I think that's exaggerated a bit, of course, but
It's an aspect that I like very much about your research is that you have managed to capture that atmosphere of storytelling and all the oral activities that are going on around this, so that what we see in the runes is just a tiny part of the text that existed, because most of it was spoken, and then the runes just capture a little glimpse of them, but they're just a small percentage of what was probably said around them. And I've got an easy question here from Petra, who asks, what kind of runes were used? Were they Norse or Anglo-Saxon?
They were Norse, yes.
Yes. And the Anglo-Saxon runes stop in the very south of Scotland, in the Scottish border, so you don't get Anglo-Saxon runes north of the Scottish borders unless it's on a portable object like a ring, for example.
And they're also a bit earlier than these runes here, so
yes.
But it's a very interesting topic, that topic of contact between these rune systems. And
yeah, that's another interesting topic altogether. Okay, we have a question from Sapreet, which is also quite an easy question. By the Earl's account, the travel to Firth was long, but how long is the distance now?
I think maybe you're better at answering that than me.
Yeah, no, it's not long. I don't know it exactly in miles or kilometers, but if you drive from Stromness to Firth, I guess it would take around 10 minutes. So how long would that be to walk?
A few hours, perhaps.
Yeah, couple of hours, 3 hours, don't know. It's not long anyway. It's not a long distance at all. It feels long if you're caught in a blizzard, I suppose.
Yeah.
Kristin asks, is it possible to create a timeline for the Maeshowe runes, meaning are they from one visit or from several visits in man over several years? You know, that's a question that researchers have asked themselves and never properly concluded on, because yeah, how would you know? But what are your thoughts on this, Karen?
Yes, I think a good proportion of them would have been carved in maybe one or a few events, but there is no way of knowing whether people came passing by and just added an inscription now and then. So that's fully possible, but I think that maybe a good proportion of them, at least, were carved in one or a few instances where several people were in there at once.
Yeah, I feel they kind of come in two categories: the longer and more contents rich ones, and the shorter ones that are mainly just names. So those that are very content rich and in dialogue with one another and responding to each other, I kind of feel it feels as if folk have been talking to each other while they've been writing them. So I kind of feel that they have been carved over a very shorter period perhaps. But
Yes.
maybe some of the names could have been added, I don't know.
Also in my thesis, I compared them to latrinalia, toilet graffiti, and those were, of course, those are made on separate instances, but still you can see a very clear thematic line of inscriptions also in latrinalia very often. So the specific latrinalia that I referred to were found in student toilets at NTNU in Trondheim, the university there. And those referred to popular culture and created a narrative around that. So those inscriptions were made, I don't know, during a few months. So they all referred to stories that everyone visiting these toilets knew, and then they didn't need to be in there at the same time to create these inscriptions.
Yeah, that's true. They don't go to the toilet together. So I suppose with Maeshowe, they could have responded to an inscription that they see on the wall and read. But as with the toilet inscriptions, is like films and things that people talk about that they refer to. So there's still a dialogue going on in the community around them. Yeah.
But there's also references to things that other people have said or that other people have written. And that indicates, I think, that it was common knowledge who had carved what, at least in some instances. So the carvers must have known each other briefly, at least, I think.
I thought it was a fantastic idea to compare the runic and graffiti with toilet graffiti. That was that amused me greatly. Our friend Chris Matthews is coming back in and saying it's about 8 miles from Stromness to Firth. Okay, I'm going to go up to the chat because I think there were questions there. Oh yes, here's one from Ruth saying, is there a way of identifying a person's style of carving similar to an individual's handwriting?
I think in theory it should be possible, or I thought it was maybe possible, so I made an attempt in Maeshowe. But I tried comparing, for instance, bows with angled, for instance, the R rune, it looks similar to a capital R, and it can be a capital R letter, that is, and it could have a bow or it could be bracketed. But that actually changed just in individual inscriptions. So the carvers used both. And I think maybe it's, for instance, due to the hardness of the stone, for instance, it could sometimes be easier to make the bow and sometimes it's easier to make the bracket. I don't know. But I think, yes, maybe we have too short texts to actually be able to identify a style of a carver before the inscription is ended. There are a few attempts, but very few that are successful, I think, of identifying carvers. What do you think, Ragnhild?
I have personally never been able to distinguish between the handwriting of different carvers. We can see that some are like big and some are small and some are closer together and so on, but I'm never sure how much of that is down to the surface that they're writing on and how uneven it is and how much space is available and how much is already taken and so on. So yeah, I don't know. Eri Ikawa, who's joining us from Japan today, is asking, it's interesting to learn the context of the group storytelling about the treasure taken out before their arrival. Do you think it was made into a sort of motif in the collective storytelling in Maeshowe because they could not find the treasure but wanted to believe in the existence?
Yeah, I think that's likely. That Barnes has a discussion regarding that, if there was a treasure in Maeshowe, for instance, but he states that that's very unlikely that there was ever any treasure. That's because of the burial customs of the Neolithic age. I think they didn't bury treasures, so they would only have found bones when they entered, and perhaps they were a bit disappointed. Yeah.
I also think they expected a treasure because they had their own, in the Norse culture, there's other stories about treasures and being called the Haugbui, hog boy who guards the treasure. So when they see a mound like that, it looks like a mound in one of those stories.
And of course, it could also be that they thought that, okay, there should have been a treasure in this mound, and what happened with this treasure? Who came in before us? Who tricked us? It could be some sort of fantasizing about that as well. Yeah.
Wishful thinking. Yeah. Oh, this is wonderful. There's so many notes of thanks in the chat. I can copy them over to you if you want to keep them, but folks saying how much I enjoyed and appreciated this talk, and that it was very interesting. And it's coming up to 5 o'clock now and 6 o'clock for you, so it's even later in Norway on a Friday night. And I would like to add my own note of thanks here on behalf of the Archaeology Institute. Thank you so much for joining us from Norway and telling us about your research on Maeshowe, and hope to see you again. Well, I will see you again at the Runology conference. So if you'd been in the room with us now, we would all have clapped. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The next talk in this series is on the last Friday of May, same time. And the speaker then is Nadine Nolde from the University of Cologne. And that talk will be hybrid, so it will take place at Orkney College, and those who are here in Orkney are welcome to join us at Orkney College at 4 p.m. on the last Friday, 27th May. But those who are not in Orkney or prefer to join from home can still join us via video conference. So this will come up on the archaeologyorkney.com website in the next couple of weeks. So pay attention and you'll find it there. Thank you and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks for listening.